Welcome to the Level Up Artist Podcast. We are your hosts, Adriana Amay and
Jackie Sanders. We are two art professionals sharing forth the advice and business lessons we have learned along our creative journeys.
We talk to artists, leaders, and art professionals to demystify the creative process and discover new ways to succeed as a career-minded artist.
If you find value in these conversations, please go ahead and subscribe. This will help other creatives like you find our podcast, and you'll be notified when we drop a new episode every Tuesday. So on today's episode, we are talking about a very timely topic about how to recover after holiday burnout. I know both of us are feeling it in varied degrees. Based on the number of times we had to just read our intro this morning, it's kind of indicative to where our headspace is. So overall are you feeling, Adriana, now? It's in the middle / right after the peak of the holiday burn. I don't know what else to call it.
I don't know. It's kind of weird because sometimes when we're at this stage, I feel like, I don't know if it's too early to be fully burned out or too late to be fully burned out or appropriate to feel burned out. I don't know. All the questions, all the things, but essentially what I've been trying to do is doing my very best. Not always succeeding, but that's okay. That's part of our process, right?
Yeah.
To manage my existing workload before going full crispy, which, as most of you probably know if you've heard us before, it's kind of our description or comparison that we use to like a cookie that you have to take out of the oven. Otherwise, it'll go to, basically dust if it's too hard and disintegrates.
Yeah, it's
as opposed to soft and chewy.
It's those stages like right before burnout, which it took both of us so much time to recognize those signs for ourselves. And sometimes we see the signs and still ignore them. It happens. Yeah. But I think inevitably as creatives, you're going to get burnt out at times. Mm-hmm. As humans in general, we all get burnt out. And so it's trying to recognize what are those stages before you hit full on debilitating burnout where it like completely stops your momentum to where, okay, where can I put the brakes on it so that it's still sustainable for, as you mentioned, like this season of your business or life or whatever. Because I think that is part of it too of, okay, it's too early or it's too late or I'm still in the thick of whatever project season. Like, well, I can't feel burnt out yet. It's only
fill in the blank.
Yeah. You're like, I still have 3 more weeks of this. I still have 2 more weeks. And we've all felt that too. So it's almost then the doubling of, okay, well, I have to push through even though I'm already feeling these signs of burnout.
Yeah. And I feel like the most important thing when it comes to that is like trying to be as proactive as possible.
Yeah.
Because it's like, if you catch it early enough, then you can kind of institute different ways, which we'll talk about, different ways to kind of say, okay, I'm acknowledging where I'm at and I need to do something before this goes full-blown burnout, because it's a lot harder to recover.
Yeah.
If you got to that breaking point, as opposed to saying like, okay, I feel it, I need to take a step back, I need to reassess. What can I take off my plate? Mm-hmm. What kind of things am I adding to my to-do list that are self-imposed tasks and deadlines that really don't have to be as tight or as full of pressure, I guess I could say.
Right.
So I know that at least for me, a lot of it has to do with that feeling of everything came together at once. So teaching opportunities, new idea for work, prep for upcoming exhibitions, which there's several of them happening around the same time. Holiday events, like it's just, I mean, it's good, obviously.
End of the year projects that you want to wrap up by the end of the year.
Yeah, things that have been on my to-do list that I've like made progress through the year, but perhaps I thought I'd be done with by now. And I have this pressure of like, but this was a 2022 item. Why am I not done with it yet? Which honestly, putting that guilt on it really doesn't help.
Yeah.
But it's also like holding ourselves accountable too, because if we don't, then it would just continually getting, that can just keeps getting pushed down the road. And that's not helpful either.
Right. And so it really is that culmination of typically, especially as creatives, of that culmination of so many different things. Mm-hmm. The long days, the tasks that you wanted to get done, the tasks that you are getting done that took longer than you thought. But for me, honestly, I feel like a lot of it historically has come from that guilt of, oh, I should be at this place in my business, or I wanted to be at this place with my creative practice by the end of the year, where it can be a double-edged sword, especially for the holiday time specifically, because it pairs up with the end of the year. People are naturally in that like nostalgic phase. You're in that looking back at the past year, but also looking forward to the next year, which as creatives, career-minded artists, business owners, inherently you're then going to be saying, this is where I want to go next year, but also looking back at your goals this year, why haven't I hit this thing yet? Or I thought I would be doing this thing. So that guilt almost is, for me, half the battle with burnout. It's the guilt of not doing certain things just as much as it is of the long days in the studio or the long hours putting in admin work for, let's say, a product release.
Yeah. The shoulda, coulda, woulda is definitely dangerous. And at least on my end, I don't think it's so much, yes, there's guilt, but there's also this, it's almost like it replays in your head and repeat, which to me, that's the most dangerous part of it, of like, I need to do this, I need to do this, I need to do this, I need to do this. And it's like, yeah, but is it really that important, or can I push it aside? And it's like, no, you need to do this. And the answer, I mean, there's no perfect answer, but because we are running our own businesses, it's almost like, don't be that boss that's just like, here's a task list of things, and I don't care you have Christmas coming up, you got to do all these things before you go on holiday, which is, I mean, if you work for yourself, do you really want that? I sure don't.
Right. Don't be a bad boss to yourself. Don't be a bad
boss.
That's a quote I heard early on, and it is so powerful. Just as you were saying, like, if you were a boss that was like, you know what, you have to miss that family holiday party because you have to stay and get all these things done, even though they won't have an impact on the business for like 3 more months. Like,
if that,
realistically,
they may not even have an impact at all.
Right. But for whatever reason, you may have in your head that I have to get this thing done. So a lot of at the end of this year, which I think is one of the awesome post burnout, or if you feel yourself getting crispy strategies that we both have talked a lot about this month and this holiday season, is just reevaluating those priorities. Do a brain download of everything you wanted to get done, have to get done, feel like you should get done, and then apply the Eisenhower matrix, which we've talked about on other episodes, and really decide what are things that you have to do, what are things that can be scheduled in the future to do, what things can you delegate, and then what things really, if you've pushed them off on your to-do list for the past 6 months, can you just delete them? Like, what would happen if you just deleted it from your to-do list? If you think about it 3 months from now again, okay, add it back on. But a lot of the time we think, oh, if we had this one fleeting thought 6 months ago, now I feel bound, so I have to do it. When you're like, maybe there's a reason you've been putting it off. So that's one way to kind of pare down if you're still in the thick of your burnout period or still in the thick of your holiday to-do list. But let's really talk about how we can recover from burnout. If it's after your markets, after your big product launches, after a big project at any point in the year, there are a few things that we have found with our experience with burnout, because it has definitely happened, of things that help during that process. And we honestly, I think, approach it very differently.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think so.
Similar but different. Like for me, when I feel burnt out, when it comes to our studio practices, I need to take like 100% disconnect time from my studio, from making.
Okay, that is
like
different.
I won't make artwork for like 2 weeks. And you are very different. You're like, I need to make something every day.
I would shrivel up and die.
Yeah.
I'm kidding.
We're very different creatives, and neither one are like more or less, but I think it's worth acknowledging like the different ways in which you can
like we both will take breaks. It's just we take the breaks differently.
Yeah.
Like with yours, that might be like you just mentioned, like I'm gonna stop making.
Right.
For me, it's like more of don't even go to the studio at all. Stay home is my version of it. But that's usually just a day or two. And then I'm like clawing at the walls, get me out of here. Yeah. You know, kind of like feeling claustro in my own house. I need to go to the studio and make things. So,
and you like have a iPad drawing practice. So you may still be doing that.
Oh, I still do things at home, but it's not the same physical exertion. So for me, it's more like remove yourself. Let's put it this way. There's a reason that I had to move my studio out of my house. And it's, you could say in a way, like art making for me brings out workaholic tendencies is the best way I can describe it.
Yeah.
And it doesn't feel like work to me, but I have to acknowledge, and I keep track of my time. I have to acknowledge that I will work myself to the bone.
Right.
When it comes to the making part. Admin, we're not there, but definitely the making creation part of it, I can work ridiculous hours because it drives me, it inspires me, it energizes me, but it also drains me. So for me, it's not so much of a I'm going to stop making, but perhaps it's number one, creating that physical distance of like not being in the place where I'm like making all the time. So I have to literally not go to the studio.
You almost like instill barriers, so it forces you to slow down.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
You can't get time warped into 6 hours of painting time because you don't have your paintings there. Like,
and that's why everything's in the studio so that I don't do that anymore. Because I used to have my studio at home and it would be like middle of the night, wake up, I can't sleep. I'm just going to go to the studio, like, or, oh, I haven't eaten for like 8 hours. The cats and the dogs are like, calling out like, where's my food? And it's like, oh, whoops, I've been doing this all day. But there's that. But then there's another thing that I do put into action that I feel like it's helpful. It's not just that physical barrier. The other thing that I do that perhaps in this way we might approach it slightly different is if I do get to that point of burnout, one of the ways that I recover is to actually do things that don't quote unquote matter. So this sounds silly. I'll just elaborate. Essentially things that I can experiment or new mediums, like put that beginner hat again or that's the discovery hat again. Yeah. And then just say like, I'm going to make this thing like the other day, last week, 2 weeks ago, whenever that was.
What is time these days?
I don't know. What are words too? But essentially like the other day I was like feeling the edges getting a little crispy and I was like, oh no. We gotta nip this in the bud. We gotta nip this in the bud.
We got things to do. We can't feel crispy.
Exactly. So essentially there was a day I came into the studio and I said, you're not doing anything for sale. We're not doing anything for sale. We're not doing anything that will possibly lead into other things that will develop other things, which honestly, at the end of the day, it could.
It always
you can't really stop it if it's meant to be. But I was like, I'm going to just get my hands dirty with paint and or clay and just have at least a few hours where whatever I'm doing, it's just to release some of this pressure and some of this stress. Yeah. And I'm just going to experiment and have fun. And it was great. Like it was a good way to let some of that go, almost like self-therapy.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's the word. Anyways,
I think that is a good thing of it's just relieving yourself of that pressure. Yeah. Inevitably, anytime we're making art or thinking about our art or thinking about new concepts, it ultimately can and probably will affect our work long term.
Yeah.
But that is something that's similar, I think, for both of us, where for you, it's a very tactile experience of being a beginner again and discovering a new medium making things. And for me, which I didn't really realize until we just talked about now of like my disconnect from the studio space. It's really like becoming a beginner again in my art concepts. So typically if I do take a few days or even like a week or two away from my physical studio making practice, I might still even be in the studio, but it's just more admin work or just like my daily drawings. Reorganizing. I love reorganizing. If you've been to my studio, you may be able to tell. But one thing that I find when I'm feeling crispy or like during a burnout or right after burnout, I really lean into journaling a lot. So it's really unpacking concepts and ideas that I go into the same pressure or relieving myself of pressure with at first it might not seem obvious as to why or how they're connected to my creative practice. But then once I get back into the studio and I'm making work, I realize that there are parallels between the work I'm making and these concepts and ideas and questions that I'm posing in my journals. So it's almost like shifting to another, what on the surface may appear as, oh, like I'm not doing anything, but it's really just diving into another facet of my creative practice because words and concepts and ideas and language are a big part of the physical paintings that I make.
Same.
Yeah.
Same. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I mean, the approach is slightly different, but I think it leads us to similar places.
Yeah.
I think also too, for me, it's important I feel like creativity is like a battery, essentially, that we have built in. And it gets depleted. And then when it gets depleted, that leads to burnout and all those things. So I feel like it's also important to be cognizant of when you're running low. And then to me, finding inspiration helps refill it. So for me, like ways that I'll do that is I'll definitely spend more time in nature. I mean, it's kind of cold right now, but it can be refreshing to get some of that brisk snow weather thing in your
I
face
love
for
it.
a moment.
It's the best.
Yeah, no, well, you're from the north. I'm from the Caribbean, so
that's fair.
Yeah, my tolerance for cold is like much smaller. But definitely nature. Definitely kind of like what you mentioned before, or what we mentioned before about like being a beginner again. I feel too like taking a workshop or online class by somebody else where I'm like, that's not going to lead to anything. Maybe I'll add a tool or two to my skill toolbox, so to speak, but it's not meant to lead anywhere else. I'm just sitting there almost passively and learning from somebody else. I feel like that is helpful too. But basically, like, instead of just focusing on, oh my gosh, I can't believe nothing's coming out, like I'm just like, I just feel stuck, then instead of going, okay, need to take a step back, kind of like we mentioned, I need to go ahead and think about, is there something fun that I can do that's not necessarily conducive to something, for your business, but then also how can I refill that tank and get some of that creativity again without the pressure?
Replenishing that inspiration.
Wait, what's the saying you say a lot? The no pressure, no expectations?
Yeah.
No. Is it that? No, it's similar.
No excuses, but no expectations. Which for me, it's one of those like, I apply that a lot to my art making practice of like, okay, you have to go and do X assignment that I give myself. It might be an hour amount in the studio, it may be a quantity of pieces I want to make or whatever task. Like you just have to do it. You don't have any expectations on the end result. You can't be hard on yourself for not having it turn out the way you wanted or whatever, but like just be present in that experience and like just do it no matter what. And I think what you were saying earlier about finding inspiration, that's also different for everyone too, where we find inspiration as artists. And one thing for me, when I feel like I'm getting burnt out, it's typically because I have been neglecting maybe my physical health or my mental health. And so a lot of that comes from moving my body, very similar to a creative practice of a fitness routine or nutrition are very closely tied for me. And especially when thinking about burnout, one thing that I've learned to kind of avoid burnout as frequently is recognizing the similarities between being an athlete and being an artist, to where there are ebbs and flows of your creative practice. I'm a huge person that values consistency, but recognizing like every season, you're not going to be in the same structure. Every season, you're not going to have the same routine. And it's only those expectations when you're like, oh, well, I'm not making as much work as I was back in the spring or back in the summer, but your routine is so different now. It's just like if you were a runner preparing for a marathon and then you get down on yourself because you didn't do your normal 4-mile run the day after you just did a marathon. Like it's a pretty black and white example of like, chill out. You just ran a marathon. Take a few days off. Don't feel bad about it. And I think in the creative practice, especially if you're right after a burnout phase, you might be feeling that too. Be like, I have to get back in the studio. I have to do this. I have to keep pushing and being consistent. Be like, recognize the wins that you just had. Recognize these big mountains that you just climbed in your practice, in your business, these goals that you hit. And that's, I think, another great thing with recovering from burnout is reflecting back on your year and celebrating those wins that you've had. Because once you start listing those out, once you start really looking at them, that it really is helpful of recognizing, wait, I have done a lot this year. I have conquered a lot of milestones. So yes, there may be one or two that I quote unquote should have hit or wish I had hit. But look at all these other things that I accomplished. Look at these markets that I was in, a group exhibition, number of sales, whatever your metric was of your goal for the year, and celebrating any of them that you hit, because that's more progress than you were this time last year.
Yeah. And even if they seem small, like I feel like you'll hear us say this a lot about like tracking our time, tracking our tasks, documenting them in some way or another. We're not going to remember everything that happened. Heck, I
Yeah.
don't remember everything that happened last week, but I have an app for that. So there you go. I think that's important because that's also a way that in looking back, it'll help you identify when the burnout may have happened or what triggered it.
Right.
So that you can avoid it in the future. So it may have been like, okay, you do a look back, right?
Mm-hmm.
In order to celebrate the wins, which I think is extremely important, but also in order to celebrate what things, not celebrate what things, but identify which things added unnecessary pressure, perhaps. So you might be like, okay, tracked my time. I can't believe I spent so much on TikTok. Whoops. I mean,
Right.
I think that's like universal at this point for anybody that uses TikTok. But it's not meant to be a, oh no, you shouldn't have, just shaking my finger at you. It's more like, okay, what can I do to spend less time with that, which I feel more guilty than productive about it. And it did not have the same recovery
Right.
value than perhaps just doodling for a few minutes in the morning. You know what I mean? Like it's more of a almost like assessing and giving them, I don't want to call it scores, but almost in a way and saying, okay, if I'm weighing this activity versus another, and I spent the same amount of time on these two, which one was least burnout inducive?
Right. Which ones are adding energy to your levels and which are depleting energy?
Exactly.
Because both are needed. And just because something drains your energy doesn't mean it's inherently bad. You just kind of have to know that like you have to learn yourself and your workflow better to implement it in moderation.
Exactly.
So like for some, let's say if like the admin tasks of a business, if you find that is energy draining, then it's okay. Well, rather than getting to the end of a timeline and having to do like a marathon 10-hour day to get all these things done, and then 2 days after you hit burnout, you can look at your timesheet and be like, yeah, maybe that wasn't the best choice. Maybe
split it up.
So then how can you create a system moving forward to say, okay, rather than a 10-hour day, how about every day for 30 minutes, I break it up into subtasks and then see how you feel after that. And I think that's a great thing of really being, if you are tracking your time based on tasks that you have to do in your business, but also documenting what you're doing outside of your business. Because maybe it's, oh, I worked 10 hours in my business this week and I feel totally burned out. But a month ago, I spent 10 hours in my business and I didn't feel burnt out. What's the difference there?
Exactly.
It maybe was, oh, you spent 10 hours on your business, but then you also had 3 social gatherings with friends or art events, which if you're an extrovert, I'm like, that can fuel me to put more work into my business. If you're an introvert, you're like, oh, well, the admin work and a social gathering, that's double depletion.
I need more days in the studio.
Let me avoid that. So it's almost not thinking of time and how you use your time as like an exchange of value, but understanding yourself as a business owner and as a creative of what fuels your tank and what takes away from the tank, which I think ultimately is the game that all of us are playing, especially as creatives, because our energy levels directly reflect and are reflected in the work that we make. If you are totally burnt out, your creative output is inherently going to be affected, sometimes more obvious than others, by the energy that you put into it. So like it is our job to take care of ourselves. It is our job to take care of our health, our physical health, our mental health, because that ultimately is our business. And so recognizing what helps me feel energized, what pushes me forward, and then what things in my schedule are maybe depleting of my energy that if capitalized on top of each other may lead to burnout. By recognizing those things and putting systems in place moving forward, you can really avoid the burnout.
Or at least know how to get around it a little bit.
Or recognize signs that you're getting crispy. Because I think that's probably been one of the most beneficial things that after us talking for so many months and recognizing that distinction is it's never going to go away. There's never going to be like this hyper consistent, I just have perfect energy level all the time. And there are ebbs and flows in your business. But if you can at least, it's our responsibility as business owners and creatives to recognize the crispy signs for ourselves, because they're different for everyone, recognize them, acknowledge them, and have a plan in place to, okay, when that happens, what do I need to do? What to-do list do I need to reevaluate? What becomes top priority and what suddenly doesn't matter? Because long-term sustainability is ultimately the goal.
Yeah. And I love that we focus mostly on the business side, because at least for me personally, that can be the most draining one. As opposed to the creative side, I feel like mirrors a lot of that the same way. Creativity is a cycle. Like, you can't be on creating new ideas, generating them out of the ether 24/7. It just doesn't work that way. Like, there are times when you generate the ideas, you test them out, you create things, and then you need follow times, just like, I don't know, like a farm field. I don't know. Let it rest and then rejuvenate it, right? And then keep going. And I feel like in that way, the business side and the creative side are definitely very similar, but I think it's extra beneficial, just like we've covered in today's episode, of trying to be cognizant of what's causing the depletion of your creativity or causing exhaustion in your business and whatnot, and then trying to figure out how to balance it out a little bit better. I mean, at the end of the day, that's the name of the game. And sometimes you can't. Sometimes you have all these things you've committed to, and you have a work ethic that's going to keep you on that train track, and you got to do the best you can.
Yeah.
Essentially. And
there are phases of life and phase of your business where that happens, and that's okay too.
Yeah. And we're not even going into if things happen in your personal life that also derail that, but topic for a different day. So we hope obviously you enjoyed this episode, and that you got some good ideas, or perhaps some things to think about in terms of, burnout, and then some ways to either recognize it and then do something about it, or perhaps reduce the chances of getting it.
Absolutely. As always, our blog will be linked in today's episode notes, along with show notes and links to other podcast episodes.
If you want to stay connected with us in between episodes and share your favorite bits of the episode, you can reach us on social media. I'm at May Art across all platforms.
And I'm at J Sander Studio on all platforms. Or if you want to stay connected with the podcast, we are at Level Up Artists on Instagram. Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.